Section 7 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 4, Part 1. Father St. Clair and Johnny set out the next day, accompanied by 2 servants on horseback. The road was quite new to Inglesant after they left Malmesbury, and he was greatly delighted and amused with all he saw. The fair landscapes, the prospects of goodly cities with the towers and spires of their churches rising into the clear smokeless air, the stately houses and gardens, the life of the country villages, the fairs and markets, strolling players, the morris dancing, the drinking and smoking parties, the conjurers and mountebanks, peasants quarrelling together by the ears, and buying and selling, wandering beggars and half-witted people called Tom-a-bedlams, who were a recognized order of mendicants. Everything amused and delighted him, especially with his companion's witty and penetrating comments upon all they met with. At Windsor they walked on the terrace, from which Johnny saw the view, which was often considered only second to that of Greenwich, of the river and many pleasant hills and valleys, villages and fair houses far and near. As they rode along, at every suitable opportunity and at night after supper at the inns, the Jesuit explained to Johnny the position of public affairs. He told him that though the power of the king and the archbishop was apparently at its greatest height, as the trial and condemnation of Laud's traducers, Prynne, Bazuk, and Burton had just been decided, and the trial of Hampden for refusal to pay ship money was about to commence, yet nevertheless the impossibility of governing without a parliament was becoming so evident, and the violent and aggressive temper of the people was so marked, that he, and those like him, who possessed the best information of what was passing throughout all classes and among all parties, however secret, considered that changes of a very remarkable character were imminent. The temper of the people, he said, was the more remarkable because, in the one case, libellers like Prynne would have been put to death without mercy in either of the preceding reigns, and no notice taken by the people, and the tax, called ship's money, was so light and so fairly levied as to be scarcely felt. The archbishop, he said, was determined to force the service book upon the Scots, a most unwise and perilous proceeding at the present moment, and he was informed by the emissary priests then in the north of England and Scotland that the resistance to it would be determined, and that the Scottish malcontents were supported by the Puritan party in the English Parliament. Under these circumstances he explained to Johnny that a change had taken place in the policy of some of the Roman Catholic party, who had formerly acted with Mr. Inglesant and Father St. Clair, and they arrived at the conclusion that the Church of England was no longer worth the pains of humouring and conciliating. The Queen had been advised to attempt the perversion of the parliamentary leaders, and several of the Catholic plotters had undertaken a similar enterprise. Father St. Clair told Johnny candidly that he had neither sympathized entirely with these views, nor altogether with those of the party to which he had hitherto belonged. On the one hand, he had arrived at the conclusion that Laud was a true servant of the Church of England, and would never consent to submission to Rome, except on terms which could not be granted. But on the other hand, he had so long regarded the Church as the natural ally of Rome, and the uselessness of attempting to win over the Puritans was so apparent, that he had not entered warmly into these new schemes. He, however, was inclined to think that were a change to take place and the Puritan party to gain the supreme power in the state, the reaction among the upper classes would be so great that the Romish faith would gain numberless converts. He finally pressed upon Johnny the necessity of great prudence, telling him that he should be immediately placed about the person of the Queen as one of her pages, and as soon as possible transferred to the King's service in as high a post as the influence to be exerted could command, in order that he should possess as much influence as possible, that in the meantime his business would be simply to become acquainted with as many of all parties as he possibly could, and to gain their confidence, opportunities for doing which should be given him both in the assemblies he would meet at his father's house and in other company into which he should be introduced. He warned him against crediting anything he heard, unless assured of its truth by himself, the most exaggerated reports upon every subject, he said, prevailing in the court and the city. The conversions to Romanism, he told him, though numerous, were nothing like so many as were reported. as might be supposed when the reputed ones included such men as Mr. Endymion Porter, the most faithful servant of the king and a firm Church of England man, though like many others entertaining very friendly opinions of the Papists. Conversing in this way, they entered London one afternoon at the beginning of August 1637. Johnny, as may be supposed, was all eyes as they entered London, which they did by Kensington and St. James's Park. The beautiful buildings at Kensington and the throng of gentry and carriages in the park astonished him beyond measure. As they passed through the park, many persons recognized Father St. Clare, but they passed on without stopping, through the gateway by the side of the beautiful banqueting house into the narrow street that led by Charing Cross and the Strand. The crowds were now of a different kind from those they had passed in the park. They passed several groups assembled round quack doctors and itinerant speakers, one of whom was relating how the congregation of a parish church the Sunday before had been alarmed by an insurrection of armed papists, stories of this kind being then a common invention to excite and stir up the people. At one of these groups they were startled by hearing a man who was selling books announce the name as Jesus Worship Confuted. As the thing was new to the Jesuit, he stopped and ordered one of his men to dismount and bring him one, when it was found to be a tract against ceremonies and especially against bowing at the name of Jesus. They resumed their passage down the Strand, Father St. Clare remarking on the strange ideas a stranger would attach to the state of religion in England if he listened only to the opposing cries. All down the Strand the Jesuit pointed out the beautiful houses of the nobility and the glimpses of the river between them. They stopped at last at Somerset House, then a large rambling series of buildings extending round several courts with gardens and walks on the river banks, and a handsome water gate leading to the river. They went to the lodgings of Father Corey, the Queen's confessor, who was at home, and received them hospitably. Johnny was so taken up with all the astonishing sights around him, especially with the wonderful view up and down the river, with the innumerable boats and barges, the palaces and gardens and churches and steeples on the banks, that it was a day or two before he could talk or think calmly of anything. The next morning the Jesuit took him to his father's house on the north side of the Strand, where he saw both his father and brother, it not being the latter's turn in waiting at the court. Mr. Inglesant was not more affectionate to his son than usual. He appeared anxious and worn, but he told him he was pleased at his arrival, that he must obey Father St. Clare in all things, and that he would become a useful and successful man. Father St. Clare had sent for a court tailor, and ordered a proper dress and accoutrements for Johnny, who was astonished at his own appearance when attired in lace and satin, and his long hair combed and dressed. The Jesuit regarded him with satisfaction, and told him they were going at once to the Queen. Mr. Inglesant's coach was sent for them, and was waiting in one of the courts, and entering they were driven through the Strand to Whitehall. It was the 3rd of August, and the Archbishop was marrying the Duke of Lennox to the Lady Mary Villiers, the daughter of the great Duke of Buckingham, in his chapel at Lambeth. The king was expected to go to Lambeth to be present at the ceremony, but this was of no consequence to the Jesuit, who wished to introduce his protégé to the Queen alone. When they reached Whitehall, however, they found that both their Majesties had gone to the wedding, and the day being very rainy, news had been sent from Lambeth immediately after the ceremony that the Queen was returning, and she was then on the water. The Jesuit and Johnny left their carriage and went down to the water gate. The Jesuit was evidently well known at the court, and way was made for him everywhere. At that time the greatest laxity was allowed to the Catholics, and other priests besides the Queen's confessors were tolerated openly in London. As they reached the water gate, the rain had ceased for a time, and a gleam of sunlight shone upon the river, and rested on the Queen's barge as it approached. Johnny's heart beat with excitement as it reached the steps amid a flourish of trumpets, and the guard presented arms. The Queen, splendidly dressed, came from under the awning and up the steps, accompanied by her gentlemen and the ladies of her court. Johnny never forgot the sight to his dying day, and it was doubtless one to be long remembered by those who saw it for the first time. When the Queen was near the top of the stairs and saw St. Clare, she stopped, and extending her hand, she welcomed him to the court. She seemed to remember something, and spoke to him rapidly in French, to which he replied with the utmost deference in the same language. Then falling back, he indicated Johnny to the Queen, saying, "This is young John Inglesant, your Majesty, of whom I spoke to your Grace concerning the business you wot of." The King looked kindly at the boy, who indeed was handsome enough to incline any woman in his favour. "They are a handsome race," she said, still speaking French. "This one, I think, still more so than his brother." "This is a refined spirit, your Majesty," said the Jesuit in a low voice, "of whom I hope great things, if your Majesty will aid." "You wish to be one of my servants, my pretty boy," said the Queen, extending her hand to Johnny, who kissed it on one knee. "Father Hall will tell you what to do." And she passed on, followed by her train, who looked at St. Clair and the boy with curiosity, several nodding and speaking to the Jesuit as they proceeded. Johnny was duly entered the next day as one of the supernumerary pages without salary, and entered upon his duties at once, which consisted simply of waiting in anterooms and following the Queen at a distance in her walks. This life, however, was beyond measure interesting to Johnny. The beautiful rooms and galleries in the palace, with their wonderful contents, were an inexhaustible source of delight to him, especially the king's collection of paintings, which was kept in a single apartment, and was admired over Europe. Father Hall took him also to many gentlemen's virtuoso collections of paintings and curiosities, where his intelligence and delight attracted the interest and kindness of all his hosts. Father St. Clair also gave him, from time to time, small editions of the classics and other books which he could keep in his pocket, and read in the anterooms and galleries when he was in waiting. He would have been astonished if the Jesuit had not told him it would be so, at the number of persons of all ranks and opinions in the court who spoke to him and endeavoured to make his acquaintance, that they might remember him at a future time, evidently at the request of the priest. Shortly after he came to London, he was present at the Chapel Royal at Whitehall, when the king took the sacrament and presented the gold pieces coined especially for this purpose. The sight impressed Johnny very much. The beautiful chapel, the high altar on which candles were burning, the bishops and the dean of the chapel in their copes, the brilliant crowd of courtiers, the king, devout and stately, alone before the altar, the exquisite music, and the singing of the king's choir, which was not surpassed in Rome itself. As the sunlight from the stained windows fell on this wonderful scene, it is not surprising that young Inglesant was affected by it, nor that this young spirit, looking out for the first time on the world and its surprising scenes and pageants and symbols, realized the truth of what the old parson had told him, and converted all those sights into spiritual visions, this one in particular, which led back his thoughts, as it was meant, to the three kings of old, who knelt and offered gifts before the mysterious child. Johnny saw his brother frequently, as the latter had grown out of his pagehood, and held another post about the court, which gave him much leisure. The two young courtiers were at this time more alike than ever, and were much admired at court as a pair. At one of the Queen's masques about this time they acted parts somewhat similar to the brothers in Comus, but requiring greater resemblance, as in Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, and both their acting and appearance was applauded by the king himself, who began to take notice of Johnny. Mr. Inglesant, the elder, had never been a favourite with the king, who was aware of his leaning to popery, and indeed, at this time both he and his friend the Jesuit were very much discouraged at the aspect of affairs. The position of the Papists had never been so good as at present, but this very circumstance was the ruin of their party. All restraints and reproaches of former times seemed forgotten. A public agent from Rome resided openly at the court, and was magnificently fêted and caressed. The priests, though to avow popish orders was by law punishable with death, went about and preached openly without fear, and it was related as a sign of the times that a Jesuit at Paris who was coming into England coolly called on the English ambassador there, who knew his profession, offering his services in London as though there were no penal law to condemn him the moment he landed. High Mass at Somerset House was attended at noonday by great numbers of the Papists, who returned together from it through the streets as openly as the congregation of the Savoy and the neighbouring churches. Their priests succeeded in converting several ladies of some of the greatest families, thereby provoking the anger of their relations and causing them to long for their suppression. They held large political conferences openly, and ostentatiously subscribed a large sum of money to assist the king against the Scots. Clarendon, indeed, says that they acted as though they had been suborned by these latter to root out their own religion. It would seem, indeed, that the English mind is not habituated to plotting, and that the majority of any party are not equal to a sustained and concealed effort. The Jesuit, Mr. Inglesant, and the other astute members of their party, perceived with sorrow the course things were taking without being able to remedy it. The former desisted from all active efforts, contenting himself with assisting the Queen in her attempts to win over members of the Parliament to her interest, and in opposing and counteracting the intrigues of a small and fanatical section of the Papists who were attempting a wild and insane plot against the king and the archbishop, which was said to extend to even the attempting their death. As neither of these occupations was very arduous, he had little need of Johnny's assistance and left him very much to himself. Inglesant, therefore, continued the cultivation of his acquaintance with both parties pretty much in his own way. He had several friends whose society he much valued among the Papists, and he frequently attended Mass, when not obliged to by his attendance upon the Queen, but he was rather more inclined to attach himself to the members of the Lothian and High Church party, who presented many qualities which interested and attracted him. He read with delight the books of this party, Dr. Donne's and Herbert's poems, and the writings of Andrewes and Bishop Cousin's devotions, which last was much disliked by the Puritans, and indeed the course he took could not have been more in accordance with the Jesuits' plan of preparing him for future service, should the time ever arrive when such usefulness should be required. In his mind he was still devoted, though in a halting and imperfect manner, to that pursuit of the spiritual life and purity which had attracted him when so young, and he lost no opportunity of consulting any on these mysterious subjects who he thought would sympathize with his ideas. In this he had no assistance from his brother, who was devoted to the pursuit of pleasure, of worldly pleasure, it is true, in its most refined aspect, but still of such pleasures as are entirely apart from those of the soul. One of his friends had presented Inglesant with a little book, Divine Considerations of Those Things Most Profitable in Our Christian Profession, written in Spanish by John Valdeso, a Papist, and translated by a gentleman of whom Johnny heard a great deal, and was exceedingly interested in what he heard. In this book the author says several very high and beautiful things concerning the spiritual life, and of the gradual illumination of the divine light shed upon the mind, as the sun breaks by degrees upon the eyes of a traveller in the dark. But though Johnny was attracted to the book itself, he was principally interested in it by what he heard of the translator. This was Mr. Nicholas Farrar, who had founded a religious house at Little Gidding, in Huntingdonshire, or, as it was called in the world, the Protestant Nunnery, in which he lived with his mother and several nephews and nieces in the practice of good works and the worship of God. Extraordinary attention had been attracted to this establishment by the accounts of the strange and holy life of its inmates, and still more by the notice which the king had condescended to take of it, not only visiting it on his journey to Scotland in 1633, but also requesting and accepting presents of devotional books, which it was part of the occupation of the family to prepare. The accounts of this religious house and of the family within it so excited Johnny's imagination that he became exceedingly desirous to see it, especially as it was said that Mr. Farrar was very infirm and was not expected to survive very long. End of section 7. Read by Sandra, near Montreal, 2023.